Welcome to an exploration of perhaps the most fundamental challenge we face as problem solvers. Today we're going to examine the meta problem, the problem of how we think about thinking it's. The hardest problems are not necessarily in the world around us, but in the way we define and frame them. What happens when we treat problem solving itself as a solvable system? Let's dive deep into this fascinating territory where philosophy meets practical methodology. Before we can solve problems, we need to understand what a meta-problem is. A meta-problem is a problem about problems themselves. It's the challenge that sits one level above the specific issues we're trying to solve. Think of it like nested boxes. At the center, you have your specific problem. Maybe it's climate change, poverty, or a technical challenge at work. Around that, you have your problem-solving framework, your methods, tools, and approaches. But surrounding all of that is the meta-problem layer, how you think about thinking itself, how you choose which frameworks to use, and how you decide what even counts as a problem worth solving. The meta-problem is often invisible because we're so focused on the content of our thinking that we rarely examine the process It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. Why should we care about meta-problems? Because they determine everything else. The way we frame a problem determines what solutions we can even imagine. Consider how differently you approach something when you frame it as an enemy to be defeated versus a puzzle to be solved. If you see a problem as an enemy, you might use aggressive, confrontational strategies. If you see it as a puzzle, you might use analytical, systematic approaches. The frame determines the game. When we frame obesity as a personal willpower problem, we get diet and exercise solutions. When we frame it as a food system problem, we get policy and environmental solutions. Same issue, completely different solution space. Here's where it gets interesting. Most problem-solving approaches have a fundamental blind spot. They assume that the problem is out there in the world, separate from the problem solver. The traditional view treats problems and problem solvers as separate entities. The problem is out there. It's objective, concrete, existing independently of our perception. The problem solver is in here, applying tools and methods to fix what's broken externally. But what if this fundamental separation between problem and problem solver is itself the problem? What if the way we think about problems is inseparable from the problems themselves? In quantum physics, there's something called the observer effect. The act of observation changes what's being observed. The same thing happens in problem solving. The moment you decide to call something a problem, you've already shaped it. You've selected certain aspects to focus on, ignored others, and imposed a particular structure on your experience. The problem, your framework for understanding it, and your perspective as an observer are all interconnected. Take traffic congestion. Is it a problem of too many cars, insufficient roads, poor urban planning, inadequate public transit, or something else entirely? Each framing suggests different solutions and makes different aspects visible or invisible. Here's where things get really interesting. When we try to solve the meta-problem, the problem of how we think about problems, we run into recursion. We want to figure out how we should think about problems, but we need to use thinking to figure that out. It's like trying to lift yourself up by pulling on your own bootstraps. We're using the very thing we're trying to improve it. This creates what cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter calls a strange loop, a system that somehow contains itself, refers to itself, and creates paradoxical effects. This bootstrap problem appears everywhere in meta-thinking. How do you evaluate your evaluation methods? How do you think about your thinking patterns? How do you choose your choosing criteria? Imagine you're trying to choose between two different ways of evaluating solutions. You need meta-criteria to choose between your criteria. But then you need meta-criteria to choose your meta-criteria. It's turtles all the way down, or rather all the way up. So what happens when we treat problem-solving itself as a solvable system? This is where we shift from philosophy to practical methodology. If problem-solving has patterns, maybe we can optimize those patterns. First, we need to identify the key components of any problem-solving system. What are the fundamental elements that show up again and again, regardless of the specific domain? Here are 5 fundamental components that appear in every problem-solving system. Perception, how we notice and attend to information. Framing, how we structure and define what we're dealing with. Action, how we intervene or respond. Feedback, how we learn what's working. Adaptation, how we modify our approach based on what we learn. Notice that this forms a closed-loop system. Each component influences every other component. The way you perceive affects how you frame, which affects how you act, which affects what feedback you get, which affects how you adapt, which affects how you perceive. If problem-solving is a system, then there must be leverage points, places where small changes can produce big effects. Systems thinker Donella Meadows identified a hierarchy of leverage points. At the bottom, we have parameters, tweaking numbers within existing systems. This has low leverage. Moving up, we have information flows, rules and policies, goals and purposes. But at the top, we have paradigms, the shared mental models that create systems in the first place. This has the highest leverage. Most problem-solving focuses on the lower leverage points, better information, new rules, clearer goals. But meta-problem thinking focuses on the paradigms themselves, how we construct the very idea of what a problem is. When we treat problem-solving as a system, we can distinguish between 3 different levels of intervention, each more powerful than the last. Level 1 is content change, working within existing frameworks to solve specific problems. This is where most effort goes. Level 2 is process change, improving the methods and procedures we use to solve problems. This is more powerful, but less common. Level 3 is paradigm change, questioning the fundamental assumptions about what problems are and how they should be approached. Let's see how this plays out with a concrete example. Consider the challenges in education systems. Level 1 solutions focus on content, better textbooks, more funding, smaller class sizes. Level 2 solutions focus on process, new teaching methods, different assessment approaches, technology integration. Level 3 solutions question the paradigm. What is learning really? What should schools accomplish? Should education be standardized or personalized? Most educational reform efforts focus on Level 1 changes, but the real breakthroughs come from Level 3 paradigm shifts. When we question fundamental assumptions about learning and schooling, entirely new possibilities emerge. One powerful way to treat problem-solving as a system is to focus on pattern recognition. Instead of solving problems one by one, we look for the patterns that generate problems. Instead of treating each problem as separate, we look for the underlying patterns that generate multiple problems. This is like finding the root cause that's creating many surface symptoms. Consider urban problems: traffic, pollution, housing costs, social isolation. These might seem separate, but they often stem from the same pattern: designing cities for cars rather than people. Address the pattern, and you address multiple problems simultaneously. So how do we actually apply this? Here's a practical meta framework for approaching meta problems, a framework for thinking about how to think about problems. First, make your assumptions explicit. What are you taking for granted about the nature of the problem? What beliefs are you not questioning? Problems are like icebergs. The visible part is small compared to the hidden assumptions underneath. Most of our thinking operates on these hidden assumptions. Second, question the boundaries. Where does the problem start and end? What are you including and excluding? How might different boundaries change the problem entirely? Third, examine your frames. Are you treating this as a technical problem, a social problem, a resource problem? Each frame makes certain solutions visible and others invisible. Fourth, look for patterns. Does this problem connect to other problems? Is it part of a larger system? What generates problems of this type? Fifth, apply this framework to its. How are you framing the meta problem? What assumptions are you making about problem solving? This prevents you from getting stuck in any single meta framework. Here's the beautiful paradox. The more we understand the meta problem, the more we realize that the biggest problems aren't problems to be solved, but ways of being to be cultivated. When we go deep enough into meta-problem thinking, we discover that many of our most persistent challenges aren't actually problems that need solutions, but invitations to develop different capacities, different ways of being in the world. Instead of solving problems, we often need to dissolve them to change our relationship to them so completely that they no longer exist as problems. Let's ground this in some practical applications. How can you use meta-problem thinking in your daily life and work? When you feel stuck on a problem, instead of working harder on solutions, step back and ask these meta questions. What am I assuming about this situation that I haven't questioned? How am I framing this problem? And what other frames might be possible? What larger patterns or systems might this problem be part of? What if this isn't actually a problem to be solved, but something else entirely? In organizational settings, you can apply meta-problem thinking by questioning not just what problems to solve, but how the organization defines and approaches problems. In personal development, instead of fixing individual issues, you can examine the patterns of thinking that generate those issues in the first place. But let's be honest about the limits. Meta-problem thinking isn't a cure-all. Sometimes you need to stop thinking about thinking and just act. Sometimes the meta level becomes a form of sophisticated procrastination. There's a balance between analysis and action. Too much meta-thinking can lead to analysis paralysis. Too little can lead to ineffective action. The key is knowing when to think about thinking and when to just think or act. The deepest insight from meta-problem thinking might be this. The way you approach meta-problems reveals something fundamental about how you approach all problems. The meta level and the object level are more interconnected than we usually realize. Perhaps the most practical outcome of meta-problem thinking isn't solving the meta-problem, but learning to live more skillfully with fundamental questions that don't have final answers. Instead of needing to close every question with a definitive answer, we can learn to live with open questions as doorways to ongoing discovery and growth. When we treat our biggest questions not as problems to be eliminated, but as tools for navigation, they become sources of vitality rather than sources of stress. The real challenge isn't understanding meta-problems intellectually. It's integrating this understanding into how you actually think and act in real situations. Like any skill, meta-problem thinking requires practice. The goal isn't to become a perfect meta-thinker, but to develop the habit of occasionally stepping back and examining your own thinking patterns. Start with small, low-stakes problems. Practice questioning your assumptions, examining your frames, and looking for patterns. As you get more comfortable, you can apply this to larger, more complex challenges. Here's what often happens when you consistently apply meta-problem thinking. Solutions emerge that you couldn't have planned or predicted. When you change how you think about problems, new possibilities appear. When you shift your thinking pattern, new possibilities emerge like stars in the night sky. These aren't solutions you could have forced or planned. They arise naturally from the new way of seeing. Finally, let's consider that some of the most important meta-problems aren't individual but collective. How do groups, organizations, and societies think about thinking? How do collective mental models shape what problems we even see? Different cultures literally see different problems because they operate from different paradigms about what matters, what's normal, and what's possible. So here's the invitation. What if you treated every problem you encounter as also being a meta-problem? What if you asked not just, how do I solve this, but also, how am I thinking about this, and how might I think about it differently? Even this video has a meta dimension. I've been trying to solve the problem of how to explain meta-problems, but what assumptions have I made? How have I framed this topic? What other approaches might be possible? Your engagement with these ideas is itself a meta-problem. How will you integrate this? What will you do with it? How will you avoid making it just another conceptual trophy that sits on a mental shelf? Perhaps the most important thing to understand about meta-problems is that they don't get solved once and for all. They're ongoing dance partners in the waltz of consciousness. Meta-problem thinking isn't a destination but a way of traveling. It's not about finding the one true way to think about problems, but about maintaining an ongoing, dynamic relationship with the process of thinking it's. Perhaps the deepest meta-problem of all is this. How do we remain open to possibilities we can't currently imagine? How do we think beyond the boundaries of our current thinking? Maybe the answer isn't in solving this meta-problem, but in learning to live it, to let it transform us as we engage with it, to let our thinking about thinking become a doorway to ways of being we haven't yet discovered. Thank you for taking this journey into the meta-problem with me. The hardest problems really aren't in the world. They're in how we frame and approach the world. By treating problem-solving as a solvable system, we open up new dimensions of possibility. Remember, the real work begins when you close this video and start applying these questions to your own thinking, your own problems, and your own ways of being in the world. The meta problem is always there, waiting for your attention.